First contact in the rain. The rain hammered against David Chen's farmhouse windows like angry fists, while lightning illuminated the Montana sky in violent bursts. He sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside his tablet, scanning weather reports that warned of possible flooding in the valley. At 42, David had weathered plenty of storms, but something about this one felt different. The animals were unusually agitated, and there was a strange electrical charge in the air that made his skin prickle. The crash came without warning, a sound like thunder but wrong somehow, more mechanical, followed by a deep impact that shook the foundations of his house. David was on his feet before he could think, grabbing his raincoat and flashlight. Whatever had just happened, it couldn't be good. The rain stung his face as he pushed through the darkness, following the trail of disturbed earth that cut across his eastern field. His boots sank into mud with each step, but he pressed on, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. The beam of his flashlight caught something that didn't belong, a metallic gleam that had no place among his crops. What he found stopped him cold. Half buried in his field lay what could only be described as a spacecraft, its sleek hull now cracked and smoking in the rain. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small RV, but its design was utterly alien. Literally alien, David realized with a jolt that made his heart skip several beats. Movement caught his eye, a figure emerging from the wreck, tall and graceful despite obvious injury. In the stark beam of his flashlight, David saw iridescent skin that shifted colors like oil on water, and large, almond-shaped eyes that reflected light like a cat's. The alien, there was no other word for it, carried something in its arms. No, someone. A child. "Please," the alien spoke, its voice melodic, but strained with pain and fear. "Help us." David's world tilted on its axis. The alien was speaking English, albeit with an accent that made each word sound like music. But more shocking than that was what followed. Two more children, smaller than the first, emerged from the wreck. They huddled close to what David now realized was their mother, their skin sharing the same iridescent quality, but in softer, pastel hues. "The authorities," David began, but stopped when he saw the terror that flashed across the alien mother's face. "They will take my children," she said, swaying slightly. "We fled. We cannot. Please." David Chen had always considered himself a practical man. He dealt in concrete things, crops, weather, machinery. But in that moment, looking at a family that had literally fallen from the stars, he made a decision that would change everything. "Come with me," he said, already shrugging off his coat to wrap around the mother's shoulders. "We need to get you out of this rain." The alien mother's name was Nyara, she explained once they were inside and dry. Her children, Kai, Lyra, and Little Soul, huddled around her on David's couch, wrapped in every spare blanket he owned. They had fled their homeworld of Lysaria, she told him, though the reasons remained vague. There was pain in her voice when she spoke of it, and David didn't press. "Our ship," Nyara said, looking out the window toward the crashed vessel. "It contains a cloaking device. Still functional, I think. It will hide the wreck from your world's detection systems. But we need to move you somewhere safer," David finished. He ran a hand through his graying hair, mind racing through options. His farmhouse was isolated, yes, but people did come by. Delivery drivers, fellow farmers, the occasional government inspector. Hiding 4 aliens would be complicated. "There's an old storm cellar," he said finally. "We can convert it, make it comfortable, a temporary solution until we figure something out." Nyara's large eyes met his, and David felt something shift in his chest. There was such intelligence in that gaze, such fierce determination mixed with vulnerability. "Why would you help us?" she asked softly. "You know nothing about us. We could be dangerous." David looked at the children. Kai trying to be brave at about 12 Earth years, Lyra clutching her mother's hand at maybe 8, and tiny Saul, no more than 4, already half asleep against Nyara's shoulder. He thought about the fear in their eyes, the desperation in their flight across the stars. "Because it's right," he said simply, "and because sometimes the most human thing we can do is help someone who needs it, no matter where they're from." A smile touched Naira's lips, transforming her alien features into something beautiful. "Perhaps," she said, "we chose the right planet after all." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside David Chen's farmhouse, something extraordinary was beginning. As he made up beds and brought out food, as he watched these impossible guests take their first tentative steps into a new life, David couldn't shake the feeling that his world had just become much larger, much more complex, and infinitely more interesting. What he couldn't know, was that this was only the beginning. The stars that had brought this family to his door held other secrets, other dangers, and somewhere out there in the vast darkness of space, something was already stirring, setting course for Earth. Trust and tribulation. 2 weeks after the crash, David stood in his kitchen, watching through the window as Kai helped him with the morning farm chores. The boy had taken to Earth life with remarkable enthusiasm, fascinated by everything from the tractors to the chickens. His iridescent skin had developed a clever camouflage ability, settling into more human-like tones when he concentrated, a trait shared by his siblings and mother. "The boy's a natural," Martha Reynolds said from behind him, making David jump. He hadn't heard his neighbor arrive. "Martha, I didn't," David stammered, his heart racing. But Martha just smiled and poured herself a cup of coffee from his pot. "Relax, David. I've known something was up for days. You're many things, but subtle isn't one of them." She took a sip, watching Kai through the window. "Though I'll admit, I didn't expect aliens." David felt the blood drain from his face. "How?" "I saw them arrive that night," Martha said quietly. "Hard to miss a spacecraft crash, even in that storm. Been waiting to see if you tell me yourself." She turned to face him, her weathered face serious. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before David could respond, Naira emerged from the hidden entrance to the storm cellar they'd converted into living quarters. She froze when she saw Martha, her skin flickering briefly with anxiety before she gained control. "Well," Martha said, looking Naira up and down, "aren't you something special?" The tension in the kitchen could have been cut with a knife. Then Martha did something unexpected. She laughed. "Oh, don't look so terrified. Both of you. I've kept secrets for 50 years in this valley. What's one more?" She set down her coffee cup and extended a hand to Naira. "Martha Reynolds. I make the best apple pie in 3 counties, and I'm too old to care what planet my neighbors come from." The relief that flooded through the kitchen was palpable. Naira took Martha's hand, her large eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha's arrival marked a turning point. With her help, they began to establish a more sustainable life for the alien family. The storm cellar was fully converted into a comfortable living space, complete with proper ventilation and emergency exits. Martha brought clothes, books, and most importantly, her expertise in keeping things quiet in a small community. But peace never lasts long enough. The first sign of trouble came a month after the crash, when black SUVs were spotted driving slowly through the valley. They bore no official markings, but their purpose was clear. Someone had noticed something. "Government?" David asked one evening, after the children were asleep. Naira shook her head, her expression grim. "Worse, I fear. There are organizations in the galaxy that track unusual activity, groups that see profit in the suffering of others." She hesitated, then added, "The same kind that my husband became involved with." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband directly, and David waited patiently for her to continue. "Vex was brilliant," she said softly, "but ambitious. Too ambitious. He discovered something, a biological process unique to our species, something that could be weaponized." Her color shifted to darker hues as she spoke. "When he realized what they wanted to do with it, he tried to back out." She stopped, her voice breaking. David reached across the table, and took her hand. Her skin was cool and smooth against his, and he felt the subtle vibration of her distress. "They took him," she finished, "and then they came for us. They want my children, David. Our biology, our abilities, they see us as resources to be exploited. That's why we ran." The implications hit David like a physical blow. This wasn't just about hiding refugees anymore. They were up against something much bigger, much more dangerous. "We'll protect them," he said firmly, surprising himself with the fierce conviction in his voice. "Martha knows people, retired military, old families with influence. We can build a network, create a safety net." Naira looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why do you risk so much for us?" David thought about the past month, about Kai's laughter as he learned to drive the tractor, about Lyra's delight in helping Martha bake, about Little Soul's trust when he carried her back to bed after nightmares. He thought about Naira's strength, her grace, her determination to protect her children at all costs. "Because you're family now," he said simply. "And on Earth, that means something." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Then Naira moved, faster than he'd ever seen her move before, and suddenly she was embracing him. Her skin shifted through a cascade of colors he'd never seen before, beautiful and mysterious. "On Lysaria," she whispered, "we have a saying. The stars guide us to our true home. I never understood it until now." Outside, the black SUVs continued their patrols through the valley. Somewhere in the depths of space, forces were moving, searching. But in that moment, in the warm light of David's kitchen, none of that seemed to matter. They had found each other across the vastness of space, and together they would face whatever came next. What they didn't realize was that the next test of their newfound family wouldn't come from the stars above, but from much closer to home. In the small town nearby, rumors were beginning to spread, and not everyone would be as accepting as Martha Reynolds. Shadows from the stars. The harvest moon hung low over the valley, casting long shadows across David's farm. In the converted storm cellar, Naira sat bolt upright, her skin pulsing with alarming patterns of dark red and black. Something had triggered her species' natural threat response, something that shouldn't be on Earth. Above ground, David was awakened by an urgent call from Martha. "They're here," she said without preamble. "3 ships, cloaked, but my old military equipment can detect their heat signatures. They're searching the valley." David was already moving, pulling on his boots as he headed for the storm cellar. But Naira met him halfway, her children close behind her. "We need to leave," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Now." "The farm equipment warehouse," David said quickly. "We converted the back room, remember? Martha's signal jammers are already in place there." They moved swiftly through the darkness, using the cover of the cornfields. David carried Saul, while Kai helped Lyra navigate the uneven ground. Above them, something massive displaced the air, though it remained invisible to the naked eye. Once inside the warehouse, David activated the security systems Martha's contacts had installed. The building's walls were now lined with experimental technology, a hybrid of Earth ingenuity and salvaged parts from Naira's crashed ship. "They're called the Harvesters," Naira explained as they huddled in the hidden room. "They're not just after us, they're after every species with unique biological capabilities. She paused, gathering herself. "They experiment on children. Their genetic adaptability is higher." David felt sick. "Your husband discovered this." Naira nodded. Vex was developing a protection program, a way to shield developing species from exploitation. But the Harvesters infiltrated the project. They've spent centuries perfecting their methods, finding isolated families, vulnerable communities. Earth isn't even on their official survey lists yet. You're supposed to have another century before contact. But now we've drawn their attention here, David realized grimly. "I'm so sorry," Naira whispered. "We should leave, draw them away from Earth." "No," David said firmly. "We fight. Earth has a long history of dealing with bullies and tyrants. We're not about to let some galactic trafficking ring steal children from any species. A sound from outside silenced them. Heavy footsteps, methodical and searching, circled the warehouse. David held his breath, praying the shielding would hold. Beside him, the children pressed closer to their mother, their skin shifting to match the darkness around them. Suddenly, Martha's voice crackled through a hidden speaker. "David, if you can hear this, we've got company in town. Sheriff Williams is asking questions about strange lights and missing cattle. And some men in suits just showed up at the diner. But they're not with the harvesters. There's something else." David and Naira exchanged looks. More complications. "There's something else," Naira said quietly. "Something I haven't told you. The protection program Vex was working on. He didn't just discover it. He finished it. The data is stored in our children's genetic code, a biological encryption designed to activate when they reach maturity." David stared at her. "Your children are carrying the key to protecting multiple species from exploitation." "Yes," Naira's skin rippled with anxiety. "The harvesters don't know exactly what Vex hid, but they know it's important. That's why they'll never stop hunting us." Outside, the footsteps faded, but no one relaxed. This was just the beginning. "Then we make sure they grow up safe," David said with determination. "Martha's network is bigger than you know. There are people, good people, who've been preparing for something like this. People who've suspected we're not alone and have been building underground networks to protect Earth and any peaceful visitors who might need help." Kai, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Like the Underground Railroad from our history lessons." David smiled at the boy's quick understanding. "Exactly like that. Humanity has faced this kind of evil before, just on a smaller scale. We know how to resist, how to protect, how to fight back against those who would treat people, any people, as property." A new sound interrupted them. Vehicles approaching. Through a small viewing screen, they watched as several black SUVs pulled up to the farm. But these were different from the ones they'd seen before. As the vehicle's occupants stepped out, Martha's voice came through again, this time excited. "David, it's Thompson's team. From the old days, they picked up the harvester ships on their equipment. Help is here." The tension in the room shifted. These were the allies Martha had spoken of, ex-military and intelligence operators who had spent decades preparing for extraterrestrial contact, building networks and gathering technology to ensure that when Earth finally met its galactic neighbors, humanity would be ready. "Your husband was right to believe in Earth," David told Naira softly. "We might be younger than many species out there, but we've learned a few things about standing up to bullies and protecting those who need it." Naira's skin shifted through colors of hope and wonder. "Perhaps," she said, "this is why the program led us here. Earth isn't just a hiding place. It's where we make our stand." As if in response to her words, lights began to fill the sky. More ships decloaking. The harvesters were done with subtlety. But as David watched through the viewing screen, he saw Martha's network spring into action. Jammers activated across the valley, disrupting the harvesters' scanning equipment. Teams moved into position with hybrid weapon systems. The real war for Earth's future, and the future of countless other species, was about to begin. And it would start here, in a small valley in Montana, with a family that had crossed the stars to find hope. Hearts across the universe. Dawn broke over the valley, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that reminded Naira of her homeworld's eternal sunset. She stood at the window of David's farmhouse, which had become their command center, watching as Thompson's teams established defensive positions around the property. The past 24 hours had transformed this peaceful farm into what the humans called a fortress. "Penny for your thoughts." David's voice came from behind her, accompanied by the aroma of fresh coffee. He'd learned that while her species couldn't process caffeine, they found the smell oddly comforting. "I was thinking about choices," Naira said softly, accepting the cup just to warm her hands, "about how the smallest decisions can change everything. If we had chosen any other planet. But you didn't," David replied, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. You chose Earth. Maybe it wasn't random at all. Before she could respond, Thompson strode into the room, his weathered face serious. We've got movement. The harvesters are pulling back, regrouping about 50 miles out. But that's not our biggest problem. He laid a tablet on the table, showing surveillance footage. They're reaching out to some of the less savory elements in our government, offering deals. Of course they are. Nyara's skin darkened with anger. It's how they operate. They find collaborators, establish legitimate fronts for their operations. By the time the general population realizes what's happening, the harvesters are too deeply embedded to remove. David studied the footage. How many in our government know about this? More than you'd think, Thompson replied. We've had contingency plans for extraterrestrial contact for decades. Multiple agencies, private contractors, international coalitions. The problem is, they don't all agree on how to handle it. Some see the harvesters as an opportunity, a chance to gain advanced technology in exchange for cooperation. You mean in exchange for looking the other way while they kidnap and experiment on children? David's voice was hard. Not just Nyara's children, but eventually human children too, once they identify useful genetic traits. In the converted storm cellar below, Kai was teaching Lyra and Saul an Earth game called chess, their laughter occasionally drifting up through the ventilation system. The sound made both David and Nyara tense with protective instinct. We've got about 48 hours, Thompson continued. That's how long our friends in the right places can stall any official response. After that, he shrugged, all hell breaks loose. Then we have 48 hours to implement Vex's program, Nyara said firmly. The genetic encryption in my children. It's not just data. It's a weapon. A way to identify and mark harvester vessels, to broadcast their true activities to every advanced civilization in the galaxy. But what? David asked, noting her hesitation. Activating it requires all 3 children. The program is split between them as a safeguard. And the process. She stopped, her skin rippling with distress. It will be painful for them. I can't ask them to. Then don't ask. Kai's voice came from the doorway. They turned to find all 3 children standing there, their expressions solemn. We've been listening through the ventilation shafts, he admitted. We know what's at stake. Lyra stepped forward, her young face set with determination. Dad, Vex, he told us stories about Earth, about how humans fight for what's right, no matter the odds. We want to be brave like that. David felt his heart constrict at the way she naturally switched between Dad and Vex, as if she too felt caught between 2 worlds, 2 fathers. Even little Saul stood straighter, trying to look brave despite her trembling. Nyara knelt before her children, her skin shifting through patterns of love and pride and fear. My starlings, she whispered. You've already been so brave. We've got company. Martha's voice crackled through the comm system. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Government plates. Thompson checked his tablet and swore softly. They're ahead of schedule. We need to move. Now. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. David watched as Nyara embraced her children, her skin glowing with a light he'd never seen before. When she stood, there were tears on her face, but her voice was steady. David, she said softly, if anything happens. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands in his. Nothing is going to happen. We're going to protect your children, stop the harvesters, and then. He paused, gathering his courage. And then I'd very much like to take you on a proper date. Maybe show you more of Earth than just this farm. A smile broke through her tears, her skin shimmering with colors he'd learned meant joy. I'd like that, she whispered. The moment was broken by the sound of helicopters approaching. Thompson was already mobilizing his teams, and Martha's voice reported more harvester ships decloaking above the valley. Time to show these galactic bullies why you don't mess with Earth, David said grimly, or its newest citizens. As they moved into action, implementing the plans they'd prepared, David caught sight of Kai leading his sisters to the specially prepared room where they would activate their father's program. The boy caught his eye and nodded, a gesture so human it made David's chest ache. They were about to change the course of not just Earth's history, but the galaxy's. And it would all begin here, on a small farm in Montana, with a family that had become something more than human or Lycerian. They had become a bridge between worlds, a symbol of hope for every species that had ever faced exploitation and persecution. The final battle was about to begin, and Earth's first great stand in galactic affairs would be not for profit or power, but for the simple, human right of families to live free from fear. A new dawn. The Montana sky had become a battlefield. Harvester ships swooped through the clouds, their cloaking systems flickering as Thompson's teams hit them with modified EMP bursts. On the ground, black government vehicles surrounded the farm, while Martha coordinated a network of local farmers who had positioned their equipment to block access roads. In the specially shielded room beneath the barn, David stood with Nara as their 3 children sat in a triangle formation. Kai, Lyra, and Saul held hands, their skin beginning to pulse with an inner light that grew stronger by the second. "It's starting," Nara whispered, her own skin reflecting her children's glow. "Vex's program is activating." Through the monitoring equipment, they could see the children's vital signs fluctuating wildly. Saul whimpered in pain, but didn't let go of her siblings' hands. Lyra was crying silently, while Kay's face was set in grim determination. "We need to buy them more time." Thompson's voice crackled through the comm. "The harvesters, they know something's happening. They're throwing everything at us." Above ground, the sound of energy weapons mixed with more conventional gunfire. Martha's voice cut through the chaos. "David, we've got government agents pushing through the east perimeter. But something's wrong. They're fighting each other." "The good guys in our government must have showed up," David replied. Thompson's contacts coming through. A massive explosion rocked the building. Dust rained from the ceiling, but the shielding held. On the monitors, they could see harvester ships launching some kind of pods toward the farm. "Boarding units," Nayara explained, her voice tight. "They're getting desperate. If they can't have the children, they'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. David checked his weapon, a hybrid design combining Earth firearms with Lycerian energy tech. "They're not getting anywhere near our kids," he said firmly. The way Nayara's skin rippled at his use of "our" told him she'd caught the significance of the word. Suddenly, Kai cried out in pain. The program was reaching its peak, light pouring from the children's skin in blinding waves. Through their linked hands, patterns of energy began to form in the air above them, complex strings of genetic code transforming into something more. "It's a transmission," Nayara breathed. "The program. It's not just marking the harvesters. It's telling our story, Earth's story, the story of every species they've ever hunted." The light from the children reached a crescendo, and then shot upward, passing through the shielding as if it wasn't there. On their monitors, they watched it expand into space, a beacon that couldn't be ignored. "Look!" Martha's voice was filled with awe. "The harvester ships, they're being marked." Indeed, the previously cloaked ships were now visible, each one outlined in a damning light that seemed to reveal their true nature. Symbols appeared on their hulls, universal warnings that any spacefaring race would understand. These were criminals, slavers, exploiters of children. But the program wasn't finished. The light continued to spread, reaching far beyond Earth's atmosphere. Later, they would learn that it had reached every major civilization in the galaxy, exposing not just the harvesters' ships, but their entire operation, their bases, their collaborators, their centuries of crimes. In the chaos that followed, several things happened at once. The harvester ships began to retreat, their captains realizing that their anonymity, their greatest weapon, was gone forever. The government vehicles surrounding the farm erupted in conflict as different factions fought for control of the response to this first major extraterrestrial incident. And in the shielded room, 3 exhausted children collapsed into their mother's arms while David stood guard, ready to give his life to protect this family that had become his own. Hours later, as the sun rose on a changed world, David sat with Naira on his farmhouse porch. The children were sleeping safely inside, watched over by Martha, while Thompson's team secured the perimeter. "It's not over," Naira said softly. "The harvesters are exposed, but they're not defeated. And Earth, your world will never be the same." David took her hand, feeling the smooth coolness of her skin against his. "Good," he said firmly. "It's time for Earth to take its place in the galaxy. And thanks to your family, we're starting the journey by standing up for what's right." "Our family," Naira corrected him, her skin shifting through colors he'd learned to recognize as love. "The children, they've started calling you Dad when they speak to each other. I hope that's okay." David felt his throat tighten with emotion. "More than okay," he managed. "Thompson says more like us will come," Naira continued. "Other refugees, other species seeking sanctuary. Earth is becoming known as a planet that protects its own, and defines its own rather broadly." "Well," David smiled, "we've got plenty of room here in the valley. And I hear Martha's already planning to expand her underground railroad to include off-world refugees." Naira laughed, the sound like music. A human and an alien, raising 3 children together, helping to build a sanctuary for refugees from across the galaxy. What would your younger self think of all this? David considered the question. "He'd think it sounds like the beginning of a great adventure," he said finally. And he'd be right. As if to punctuate his words, a ship appeared in the morning sky. But not a harvester vessel. This one bore the markings of the Galactic Council, the first official diplomatic contact between Earth and the wider galaxy. Thanks to Vex's program, and the choices made on this small farm, Earth was entering the galactic community not as a primitive world to be exploited, but as a beacon of hope and resistance against exploitation. Inside the farmhouse, they could hear the children beginning to stir. Soon, they would need to face the implications of everything that had happened, the politics, the changes, the challenges ahead. But for now, David and Naira sat together on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in colors that belonged to 2 worlds, and marveling at how the vastness of space had brought them exactly where they needed to be. The stars had guided them home, just as Naira's people always said they would. And home, they had discovered, wasn't a planet or a species or even a place. It was wherever love made a stand against the darkness, wherever families chose to protect each other, wherever hope blazed bright enough to light the way forward. It was, in the end, the most human story of all.